The series of talks this week has been about transforming self and world. And the talk I'm giving tonight is about our relationship with the world we find ourselves in, that we're a part of. And this world includes our families, our friends, colleagues, people we come into contact with every day, our wider society in this country and globally. Ultimately, the forces outside of ourselves that make up the world we live in, everything that we think of as being outside of ourselves. How can we live in this world creatively? And how can we live a life of meaning that has a positive benefit and contribute to a better world in the future? You've already heard Samantha Vadra and Bodhi Mati talking about that a bit and done some practice together. But the question also is, what has it got to do with our Buddhist practice, and is it even part of Buddhist practice to be thinking outside of ourselves, or, to be thinking about the world? But I am going to assume that everyone here, in some way or another, would like to live in a better world, whatever that might be. So hopefully you're all thinking that there could be something that could be changed in our environment. And I'm going to be drawing on a talk that was given by Sangharakshita, who's the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order and community that we're part of. And he called his talk A Blueprint for a New World. So I'll be quoting from this and some of his other talks as I go on. But I can't claim that I'm going to give you an actual blueprint for a new world. So I'll just be asking some questions and suggesting some ways we could go about thinking about them and answering them. So firstly, most basic question. I'll be asking if transforming our world is an important or even legitimate part of Buddhist practice. And just a spoiler alert, it is. So just get that out of the way. I'll be looking at some Buddhist teachings that bring this out. Our duty to our world and our fellow human beings. I'll be talking about some reflections I've had about my own relationship with this ideal of wanting to change the world for the better. Sometimes if we have really high ideals, we can also feel very highly disappointed when things don't change how we want them to, in the time frame we want them to. And what could we actually do in practice and in terms of how we think about our relationship with the world? What actions could we all take? So firstly, I was thinking, what sort of things might we be dissatisfied about, and what are some of our challenges? So there are some things that we can rejoice in the world as we know it now. Some things like democracy, greater human rights, greater freedom from hardship. But there are also some challenges, particularly in the world now. The sheer scale of suffering that we might be aware of is unprecedented and often overwhelming. The nature of the threat to life that can seem all-encompassing, such that the very existence of life on Earth is in question. It's going to get better after this, by the way. The amount of information and stimulation that's available to us, misinformation as well, the dangers of distraction and superficiality, the dangers of consumer society and our desire for material comfort and security. And we live in a culture of cynicism and mistrust, which affirms negative emotions and values. And we identify strongly, very strongly sometimes, with nationality, race, gender, or political affiliation. So what's this all got to do with Buddhism? Aren't these challenges the concern of politicians, organisations, businesses, or other people? Isn't Buddhism about our individual practice, about becoming calmer and happier, more generous, more loving, etc., more like what we see in front of us here? Well, that's what the emphasis seems to be sometimes historically, and particularly in the West. So we have this image of the Buddha in calm contemplation. But in fact, the Buddha had a totally radical response to the world around him. And his example is one that we can still follow now in the 21st century, if we're interested in creating a better world. So we're going to talk about what it was like for the Buddha, or I am, you're not. But before that, just a little thing that Sangharakshita said. He talked about two prevailing views. So you've got one view that people are okay and you just need to change the system. You might call this a secular view. And then you've got the second view, that individuals are greedy and full of hatred, and if we want to change the world, we need to change ourselves. This might be thought of as the spiritual view. He then says, but Triratna doesn't share this view, this so-called spiritual view. In Triratna, we certainly are concerned with the development of the individual. We regard this as absolutely crucial, absolutely fundamental. But at the same time, we do recognise that external conditions can and do help or hinder. If we live under the right system, it's easier to develop, and if we live under the wrong system, it is more difficult. He says that our aim is to transform both ourselves and our world, with the ultimate aim of transforming the world into a spiritual community. So, I'm going to take you back now to 2,500 years ago when the Buddha was alive. And when we look at the life and teachings of the Buddha, we can see that there's no separation between the development of wisdom and compassion in individuals and the effort to create a more wise and compassionate world. So throughout his life and his many encounters with people, the Buddha was motivated by nothing but the welfare and liberation of those who he's talking with. And he encouraged his followers to do likewise, to go forth for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world, for the welfare, the good, and the happiness of gods and men and all other genders. The Buddha's life was not only a series of encounters with individuals, but also a response to the times he was living in. His teachings arose from his vision of suffering on the widest scale of existence. They apply to the human situation in any age, but they were expressed for particular people in particular times. So he lived in India in the 5th century BCE, and understanding the world he lives in helps us to understand his teachings. He lived in a small kingdom that would sometimes be in conflict with its neighbours. It was a farming society in which family obligations were strongly emphasised. The roles of women and men were separated on traditional lines. There was a very rigid caste system, and one's birth determined one's station in life. There were many spiritual and religious traditions. Belief in local gods and spirits was widespread, and there was a belief system based on the idea of a fixed soul. Large-scale animal sacrifice took place, and these were some of the conditions that brought happiness or suffering to the sentient beings who inhabited them. Even from this very sketchy impression of the Buddha's world, we can see some patterns. Religious beliefs underpinned the caste system. This gave privilege and security to some and suffering to others. Religious beliefs kept women in subservient roles. They also called untold misery for animals. Beliefs were not just a private matter. They had a big effect on the happiness or otherwise of people and animals. The Buddha's response to this world that he found himself in was not just to be kind to people in the ordinary sense, though he was always that. He was moved to wake people up. He wanted to challenge the unquestioned assumptions of the time He couched his teachings in terms that would subvert harmful beliefs. He gathered round him a spiritual community and accepted women and people from all castes and none. He created conditions for simple living, a breathing space for spiritual development, away from the expectations of family and farm. His monastic followers wore robes and shaven heads to eradicate the marks of caste. He personally intervened in armed conflict, persuading rival kings of the futility of war. He taught that loving kindness should be extended to all sentient beings, and this led to a widespread abandonment of animal sacrifice. All of this arose from a simple desire to end suffering. It wasn't a political position. It brought into play one's social position, friendships, living situation, livelihood, and one's most deeply held views about life. It was founded on the possibility of personal change and self-development. It was a total, radical response. My question is, in this age of modernity, what would the total, radical response of the Buddha to the world look like? To start to explore that, I just want to introduce you first to a concept in Buddhist teachings, which is that of the Bodhisattva. You might have heard of the Bodhisattva, or you might not. So these are ideal Buddhist figures who are revered all around the world, and they have different forms and different qualities associated with them. There's this Bodhisattva called Avalokiteshvara, and one of his forms is he has 1,000 arms, and in each hand he's got an eye that sees the suffering of the world around him, and an implement, a different implement in each of the 1,000 arms to help living beings out of compassion for their suffering. And similarly, there's Green Tara, who represents compassion in action. She's represented stepping down into the world with her hand out to save living beings. So this Bodhisattva ideal is actually very important to us here at the London Buddhist Centre and in Triratna. The Bodhisattva path is to be dedicated to the well-being of others as much as to our own. Becoming less self-centered is not just an incidental outcome of the spiritual life, it is the spiritual life. So we might start coming along here because we want to make our lives better. I know I certainly did when I met Shradagita in 1988. Had to get that.
Very young.
Yeah, we were so young. But our Buddhist practice is nothing if it isn't a heartfelt opening to others in a spirit of loving kindness. So we have all these practices. Some of them you've been doing this week, some of them you've done at other times maybe, or maybe not, but the Metta Bhavana meditation that we did tonight is one of them. We have spiritual friendship, we have ethical training principles, and we have Buddhist ritual. And these are actually Bodhisattva trainings. So we're sort of we have this ideal of the Buddha and the Bodhisattva, and we're trying to cultivate the qualities that those ideals bring forth to us. It doesn't matter really if those aren't the things that touch you or inspire you, but it's so important that we do have something to aspire to, something that underpins our attempts to change ourselves and the world, not just becoming a better version of ourselves, I think Maitreya Bandhu was talking about. We really need something that gives a thread of meaning in our lives, and that's more than just a wish to become a better person or a good person. And we don't do it on our own. That's really important to say. We do it together. Somebody recently said in a talk I was listening to, awakening is a team sport. Getting together with other people is essential if we want to change the world, because then I'm not just one person. Although we talk about individual bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara, Green Tara, that's just a way of thinking about things that our current unenlightened minds can understand. In reality, we're all interconnected, and there's no hard and fixed boundary between me and others, between me and you. We're connecting now in the room. Our problem is that we largely think in simple terms of me and the world. And this perspective blinds us to the very source of power that could meet the challenges the world faces. When people act together for a common purpose, thinking not in terms of me, but more in terms of we, they give rise to resources of emotion, energy, and wisdom not available to the isolated individual. So, back to me. We've touched on the Buddha's life and teachings. We've gone off into the highest realms of aspiring to help all beings. And now I want to tell you a bit about my personal reflections on how I relate to the world around me. So firstly, I want to say that I've come to realise I have a strong tendency towards negative thinking, and that's actually part of the reason I was probably given my name, because I don't always feel as if I'm happily going in the world. So that's the inspiring element of it. So it's a habitual way of seeing things that I've developed over all the years of my life, and particularly comes into play when I think of the state of the world, which I often do. I read a lot of news, and I have predictable reactions to the events I'm reading about. I've also become better at working with my mind over the years, and I have got better at having more of a perspective on things than I used to have, which I'll tell you a bit about. But what does my mind habitually do? Firstly, I can feel anger, and more than anger, actually outrage at all the injustices and pain and suffering that take place in the world. Then there's a feeling of powerlessness. What can I do? Like hand-wringing. I'm just one person. I can't influence or change anything. Then comes a feeling of hopelessness, which is when you start to believe in your powerlessness. And with that comes the thought that nothing ever really changes, so what's the point? Then I can feel a sense of wanting to turn away, to not take in anymore and just focus on my own small life and concerns. So these are the thoughts and feelings that I can experience quite easily, many times every day probably. Other responses people may experience are a feeling of overwhelm, resignation, or denial, which can mean they decide not to engage with anything outside their own life and become detached from what is going on in the wider world. Others throw themselves determinedly into efforts to bring about change, but in a way that ignores their own spiritual and ethical development and can lead to burnout. But going back to my own experience, if I reflect clearly on my life, I can see that my habitual responses of anger, powerlessness, and hopelessness about the state of the world are not really justified. I'm of an age now where I can look back at recent history and consider what changes have happened in my own lifetime. The first thing you notice when you do that, no matter how old or young you are, is that the thought nothing ever really changes isn't tenable. One of the key Buddhist teachings is impermanence. And when I look back over my 62 years on the earth, it's hard to think of anything that hasn't changed at all. So then I start to think, well, if all these things have changed, have they just changed around me, or have I played a part in it at all? And I've realised that the truth is that I can and do make a difference. You change the world in one way or another just by being in it, just by acting in the world in a particular way. And you don't even realise that you're doing it. Another key Buddhist teaching is that of taking responsibility for our actions of body, speech and mind. And to this end, the Buddha taught training principles, or precepts for his disciples to follow, which we still follow today. And this is our practice of ethics. The precepts are about acting with wisdom and compassion in all spheres of our life. But you or I might say, well, that's all very well, but what difference will it really make to the world as a whole? Well, firstly, I'd say that we all have a sphere of influence. And whether it's big or small, we do have an effect as an individual, which is what the law of karma amounts to. Our actions have consequences. I think that was probably the first thing I learned when I came here. The trouble is, for those of us who crave certainty, we don't know exactly what effects our actions will have, or when the consequences of our actions will come into being. So it can feel, from our limited perspectives, as if what we do isn't too important. I was thinking about coming along here to the Buddhist Centre when I was 26. It's such a different world. In those days, it was really a rather weird thing to do, wasn't it? It definitely wasn't part of the mainstream. So I got interested, I started coming more often, going on retreats, developing a meditation practice, learning about Buddhism. As the years went on, more and more people in our society also started doing those things. And then a few years ago, there was this huge step change where suddenly everything became about mindfulness. It was a really new concept. It seemed to explode into all areas of life. Suddenly everyone was talking about mindfulness. The practice of meditation started to seem less and less weird, and now it's just part of the establishment. There's even a mindfulness all-party parliamentary group. I think younger people here might take it for granted that these things are things that all people are familiar with. But back in 1988, I wouldn't have believed it. It honestly would have felt like science fiction to know that you could be talking about meditation and mindfulness and people outside of this small Buddhist centre would know what you were talking about. And I have to recognise that just by doing something myself, I was part of this change. I might not have been doing anything really big. I wasn't writing articles or teaching mindfulness to big business groups, but in some way, my small actions of meditating myself, teaching a little bit, talking to colleagues or family about the latest retreat I'd been on, being part of a team here for classes and retreats, it all contributed. I can't pick out my exact contribution, and I can't point to an exact outcome, but just by choosing that path, looking back, I can see that I was part of it. So this is just an example. I can see so many other changes that happened in my lifetime that make me think I should be more hopeful about the possibility of change. And it is all the more important to make sure to be part of changing things for the better. That's our responsibility in whatever way we can. So I do try to remember this when I get upset about the state of the world. And I try to think, what can I do that at least puts small steps on the path of positive change, even if I haven't managed to bring about world peace? All this is just a practical way of talking about one of the Buddha's other core teachings, the teaching of dependent arising. This means that for better or worse, the world we live in is not inevitable. It arises from moment to moment on the basis of conditions, and these conditions are changeable and interconnected, and we are the conditions. Nothing is fixed, but it seems so to us. But that's because our perspective is very narrow. We tend to look at things in a very short time span and from a very egocentric point of view. I think the example I've just given from my life is important because meditating and studying Buddhism isn't something I did on my own. Even though at the start I was certainly only concerned with making my own life better. But if it had just been me, then my sphere of influence being rather small, it wouldn't have had much of an effect. But what happened was I joined a lot of other people who were doing the same thing, who had the same values, and were putting Buddhist practice at the centre of their lives. So we have to do it with others. We have to find other people who share our values and are committed to the same things we are. And there are many other changes that I hoped I would see that haven't come into being yet. But what's the alternative to acting as if one can change the world? We have to act in accordance with our own values, and we have to have faith that our actions now will bear fruit in the future, even if we don't see the fruits now or even know what they will be. And that's where the meaning can come from in our lives. I also just want to throw in briefly that the state of the world isn't necessarily what we think. We can read and watch and listen to certain things, and we can develop a biased view of what is outside of our own experience. If you read the news headlines, you'd be forgiven for thinking that everything is getting worse, and that's because the media and human beings in general, as well as me, have a strong negativity bias. We always think the world's going to hell in a handcart, is what I always think. So bad news gets more coverage than good news, and perhaps we dwell more on the negative than the positive in what we hear, and also in how we reflect on our lives. I've been looking at this great website called Our World in Data. Do you know it's Samantha Vadra? No. It's got loads of graphs and stuff on, which are really interesting. And there's a page that caught my eye that says, "The world is awful, the world is much better, the world can be much better." All three statements are true at the same time. So yeah, if we focus on the first statement that the world is awful, well, we do too often focus on that statement, the world is awful. A pushback on this takes it to the other extreme, which is equally damaging. If you only talk about what progress has been made in the world, then it glosses over the problems people are facing. So if we only see the problems, we have no hope that the future can be better. If we only hear about progress and what is going right, we become complacent and lose sight of the problems the world is facing. Both these narrow perspectives have the same consequence. They leave us doing nothing. They're worldviews that paralyze us. And it's hard to resist falling for one or the other. But to see that a better world is possible, we need to see that both are true at the same time. The world is awful, and the world is much better, and it can be better. So what can we actually do to transform ourselves and our world? And I wanted to look at, well, I didn't really want to look at it. This is one of the areas that I don't want to look at, which is violence and conflict. But it seems to be impinging very urgently on our consciousness in one way or another these days. But what I say can be applied to any of the ills we can think of that beset the world, whether it's environmental destruction, racial injustice, dictatorships, domestic violence, etc., etc. All are based on the three main poisons that drive our actions: greed, hatred, and delusion. So looking at our experience of human violence and violent conflict, the question is, how can we begin to put an end to cycles of violent behaviour? I just picked this because, well, it's the first precept, as I'm going to go on to say, non-violence. But it's also so much on our minds if we just read any news headlines, all the difficult situations in the world that are taking place. And as well as on the world stage, all of us have had some experience of violence ourselves, either at first hand or involving someone we care about. And almost all of us certainly have also acted violently in some way. Our personal experiences will differ in severity, but we all have the experience of living in a world where violence and war happen. It's difficult to ignore. And it's the greatest challenge to our practice of the first precept. In this positive version of the precept, we say, "With deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body." In the negative formulation, we say, "I undertake to abstain from causing harm." So when someone's being is negated through violence, especially if it's ourselves or a loved one, the principle of loving kindness that we've been trying to develop tonight in the Metabhavana can seem impossibly idealistic. The precept is challenging us to hold two things at once: compassion for the person who has been violated and compassion for the perpetrator. To be capable of this, even in extreme situations, requires not only loving kindness, but a degree of wisdom and insight, which isn't always accessible to us. To radically practice the first precept is to cultivate loving kindness to all involved. It's a very tall order, but if we want real change to occur, it's something we have to be open to and to really practice. So this is where we need to start. Meditation in general, and the Metabhavana in particular, also requires us to be able to sit with the experience of suffering in our own lives and that of others. And it's not being able to be with the experience of other people's suffering that makes us turn away from difficult situations. When we can be alongside suffering, we can be of help. Otherwise, we're likely to experience one or other of the traditional enemies of metta. We can become overwhelmed and become very distressed ourselves, which can lead to aversion and trying to push suffering away or resist it. Or we can experience horrified anxiety or pity. None of these responses to suffering are metta. What we're looking for when we enter into this practice is to develop a sense of solidarity with all living beings and an understanding that we all suffer, that we are all, in the long run, in the same boat. This is not a simple proposition, as I'm sure if you've done any amount of practice, you will have understood. But the Buddha urged his followers time after time to realize a deeper understanding of the simple truth of suffering in the world and how to meet it. If we've managed to build up a certain amount of goodwill towards others and a practical ability to be less reactive, then we need to be able to communicate with other people from this basis so that we can work together to bring about change. It's very easy to get together with other people and then, starting off with similar hopes, to fall out around personalities, methods, to get into arguments, everyone pulling in different directions. When this happens, it calls for a deeper practice of non-violence. If we can learn to have more peace in our own minds, if we can be more loving, patient, and forgiving in our own lives, and put this into practice with other people, only then can we become a peacemaker in the world at large. You might or might not have heard this verse from the Dhammapada. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. It's a very challenging ideal, and it's at the heart of Buddhist teachings, and it can't be watered down or ignored. Sangharakshita also wrote this really good paper called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. In that he says, we will be able to achieve peace only by regarding ourselves as citizens of the world. Peace, in the full sense of the term, can be achieved only when disputes between sovereign nation-states, as well as between smaller groups and between individuals, are settled entirely by non-violent means. In order to achieve peace in this fuller sense, we will have to deepen our realization of the indivisibility of humanity and act on that realization with even greater consistency. We will have to identify ourselves more closely with all living beings and love them with a more ardent and selfless love. We will have to be a louder and clearer voice of sanity and compassion in the world. Above all, we will have to intensify our commitment to the great ethical and spiritual principle of non-violence, both in respect to relations between individuals and respect to relations between groups. So as I was saying, was I saying this? Yeah, we seem to be in the middle of intractable problems and wars at the moment. And then I was reflecting back again on my own lifetime. This is just one example, but from the late 1960s to 1998, there was essentially a war going on in Northern Ireland, euphemistically referred to as the Troubles. I was very affected by this because most of my family lived in Ireland, and I had a lot of connections with the country and people in Northern Ireland, actually. I used to write in my diary fervent wishes for peace in the early 1970s, but it seemed as if the war would never end. I've still got my diaries, actually, from 1973, and they are quite full of prayers for an end to the violence, year after year. Bombings, shootings, soldiers on the streets, checkpoints. You can look at footage from the 1970s in Belfast, and it's almost unbelievable now. And since 1998, there has been a peace. It's still somewhat of a work in progress. It's still somewhat imperfect, but it's holding. So what brought this about? There were many conditions, many actions by many people that brought about a political solution. But vitally important in this were ordinary people, and particularly, actually, ordinary women, overcoming their assumed responses to the enemy and advocating for peace, getting involved in conflict resolution, establishing neighbourhood networks, going on marches, lobbying politicians, often putting their own safety and their family's safety on the line. And their actions were actually transformative. One grassroots group headed up by women was called Peace People. I really want to read its declaration, but I don't think I've got time. But it's really fantastic and moving. Maybe if I've got time at the end, I'll read it. So apparently more than 100,000 people signed this declaration. So it just started with 3 people. They got this declaration together. They tapped into this wider feeling that something needed to be done, that ordinary working people were feeling. They got 100,000 people to sign the copies, and anti-violence rallies and protests took place in the 6 months after the movement's founding, and the rate of violence in Northern Ireland, as measured by number of fatalities, fell by 70%, and it continued to diminish over the succeeding decades. There are so many examples of this, and there are also so many examples of just ordinary people in every conflict and every difficult situation helping other people out. There's a terrible war that everyone's forgotten about in Sudan at the moment, and society's basically collapsed. But the people that are trying to help are just civil society activists who are just ordinary people like us. And they're having an effect. I have this really clear memory of a man called Gordon Wilson, who was in Northern Ireland one day at a Remembrance Day parade in a town called Enniskillen. A bomb exploded during the parade, injuring him and fatally injuring his daughter Marie. He was interviewed by the BBC just after the bombing. He described his final conversation with his dying daughter as they both lay buried in rubble, with his hand held tightly to his daughter. And he said, "I bear no ill will. I bear no grudge." These words were reported worldwide, becoming among the most remembered quotations from the Troubles. He became a peace campaigner and had a real effect. Thankfully, most of us, I hope, are not called on to respond to such a dreadful situation. But it's worth reflecting on whether we would be able to demonstrate such an amazing response of forgiveness and non-violence. It's also worth remembering, I think, that non-violence is a natural part of the human experience. It's not just a Buddhist precept. It's accessible to any of us. We can develop and cultivate it. Even in the middle of heartbreak and injustice, there are always people working for peace and an end to conflict. And as Buddhists, it's our duty to put this into practice in whatever ways we can. So Sangharakshita also says it's not that you just sit on your meditation mat radiating metta towards the world, but keeping well out of the way of the world. It is that metta enters into your action and expresses itself in terms of non-violent action for the benefit of others. Not just about non-violence, then it's about building unity and harmony. How do we build a more unified and harmonious world? So perhaps the first step is to recognise that it is our responsibility and that it involves the way we live our whole lives. The point is that with every interaction, we're creating unity or perpetuating division. This might start with a general attitude of friendliness, but it involves all aspects of how we treat others. Neighbours, colleagues, friends, family, people we're buying things from, everyone, in all our dealings with them. We need to recognise and let go of our assumptions about other people that we're born with or we develop through our life, and replace them with unconditional metta or loving kindness. On this foundation, the possibility of wider social change rests. You've already heard, I think, twice. Have we mentioned Dr. Ambedkar twice today already? Oh no, you mentioned him, and Pranyamanas talked about Dr. Ambedkar, and I was going to talk about Dr. Ambedkar because he's very important to our movement. And, well, I think you've heard it. He worked his way up from extreme inequality and became the architect of the constitution of the independent India. But he realised in the end that that wasn't enough, that the problems that society had were mind-made. So this relates back to Surya Gupta's talk, where she was talking about mental slavery. She was talking about Bob Marley, but what's the word? Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. So for Dr. Ambedkar, the Buddhist faith gave people access to dignity, pride, and self-respect. And the conversions that his followers, the conversions to Buddhism that his followers did, led to real change. So the statistics say that there's been a much greater improvement in the social and economic status of those who became Buddhists compared with similar castes in which very few conversions took place. So you need action in the world and you need self-transformation. This is the theme of our talks. Yeah. Sangharakshita says, I certainly think that perhaps order members, mitras and others in the West could pay a bit more attention to the objective and social issues rather than to their own subjective feelings. I hope we can learn a bit of a lesson from our friends in India who are very much concerned with social, economic and other such issues. We must have a balanced spiritual life. So Dr. Ambedkar understood that without fraternity there can be no liberty or equality. These are all underpinned by metta. Yeah, which carries the connotation of being a bond as strong as any ties of blood and kinship. Recalling the Karaniya Metta Sutta, which you may or may not have heard. Oh, this is going to topple over. So the Karaniya Metta Sutta says, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. So what would a total radical response to the world look like for us? I haven't actually answered that question. In a book called What is the Sangha, Sangharakshita strongly emphasises the role of spiritual community in bringing about change in the world. He says, an attitude of withdrawal from public concerns into personal ones is one that is not worthy of a human being. It represents an abdication of responsibility. So given that one is helpless to effect any kind of solution to these large issues, and given too that one can't turn aside and ignore them either, what is one to do? What are we to do? The only hope for humanity is necessarily a long-term solution, involving more people becoming clearer about how they need to develop as individuals, and cooperating in the context of spiritual communities in order to make, in their various ways, a significant impact on the world. And then he says, as for practical ways to effect a remedy, I would prescribe 4 courses of action. So, firstly, self-development, the development of the mind, which is probably what a lot of us come here for. The raising of consciousness to ever higher levels of awareness, and the simplifying of our life in order to make sure that that can happen. That's the first course of action. The second one he recommends is joining a spiritual community. A third one is withdrawing support where we can from all groups or agencies that actually discourage indirectly or directly the development of us as an individual. So again, he's asking us to look at what are we actually doing, what are we supporting, what are we involved with that isn't in line with these values, that isn't helping people to develop or helping to have a positive effect in the world. And the fourth course of action is encouraging the development of individuality within all groups to which one unavoidably belongs. And we do unavoidably belong in lots of groups, like some circles of friends. Well, they are sometimes avoidable, but being at home, in families, being at work, there are always people that are not going to be interested in this stuff. Still, in this situation, we can stand up for what we believe in and speak up whenever it's appropriate to do so. It is always possible, he says, to act in accordance with our ideals, even when others cannot or do not appear to understand what one is doing. So these are 4 strategies to get underway in order to begin to make a meaningful impact on world problems. He talks about a network of spiritual communities of all kinds, which could exert a significant degree of influence and might just possibly shift the centre of gravity in world affairs. And I'd say here, in Buddhist practitioners that I know, we're all concerned with having an effect on the world, whatever this looks like. And there's no blueprint I could give you for what that would look like in your life. For most people, it starts by making sure we have an ethical work life and putting our efforts into building community with other Buddhists. From there, some people decide they want to take more specific action to make change. Some people get involved in their local community, write to their MPs, take up volunteering, train with the Samaritans, get involved in local politics. I was even talking to an order member the other day who's become the mayor of Glastonbury. There have been times when there have been people here that go and sit and meditate in Covent Garden. I don't know if you know about that, called the Big Sit, or in different parts of London, or join in demonstrations together as Buddhists. There's even been a group, and I think it's coming back here, called Transforming Self and World, which meets to discuss issues, local or world events. That's not for everybody, but if we remember that every action that we have has a consequence in the world, then everything that we're doing is important. So there are always opportunities for us to take the initiative and to take action. And I just want to encourage us all to have confidence, to look around us and know that how we act together will have an effect. I'm just going to conclude with 3 points. Firstly, the world is full of suffering. If we know anything at all about the Dharma, we'll be familiar with this. Our task is to find a way that we can respond to this without getting overwhelmed. It can help to remember too that the world is also full of joy and connection, and we need to look out for and cultivate this too in our lives. Second point, change in ourselves and in the world is inevitable, and positive change is definitely possible. We have to exist in the world. We can't opt out. So let's be optimistic that our lives have meaning and our actions of body, speech and mind, from small to large, will make a difference. Third point, that's the Brownie Guide salute, if anybody remembers. The more effective our personal practice is, the more we train our minds towards the development of wisdom and compassion, the more effectively we'll be able to put ourselves in the service of others, particularly as we join together with like-minded people who share our values. In this way, In the words of one of our rituals, the fragrance of the perfect life, sweeter than incense, spreads in all directions throughout the world. That is it. Thank you very much for listening.